Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. We've been hearing some amazing talks about community, different types of community, and I want to spend a few minutes this morning still with you to talk and present you my community, the United Nations. Complicated, big organization, as you know, 193 countries, representing 7 billion people. 7 billion people we have on Earth. The staff of the UN is tens of thousands of civilian people throughout the world. Here you have the staff of the UN working in Bangladesh, surrounding the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. In addition to those, we have 120,000 peacekeepers, UN soldiers, blue-helmeted soldiers. They come from 120 different countries, and they serve in the 4 corners of the earth, on the 4 continents, in 18 different peacekeeping missions. These are often young men and women who are far from home, but who are sent to keep the peace and to rebuild communities. Here you have them in northern Mali, Chadian soldiers wearing the UN blue. In addition, the UN is obviously tens of thousands of humanitarian workers who care for those who need care. We feed 90 million people every day in 80 countries. 90 million people who depend on the United Nations and the international community to eat every day. We take care of maternal health in hundreds of countries around the world, ensuring that 30 million women every year are able to give birth without fear of dying, to ensure that young babies are able to make it past their first year. We take care of over 40 million refugees throughout the world who seek shelter in UN camps. And in fact, this year we have the unfortunate mark of having more refugees than any time since the end of World War II, due to the civil wars and the conflict we see around the world. The UN, through the World Health Organization and UNICEF, vaccinates 58% of the world's children from childhood diseases like measles and polio. Often these campaigns are done in active war zones. Here you have a team from UNICEF giving a polio vaccine to a young baby in Afghanistan. We help organize elections every year in 60 countries, ensuring a smooth transition to democracy. Here's a beautiful picture of UN ballot boxes being distributed in a remote village in East Timor in the South Pacific a few years ago during their first elections. But the UN is obviously by definition a global organization, but it's a community of people. It is meant to serve the people. The first words of the UN Charter, in fact, are "we the peoples." We intend and we put people at the center of our work. And I think the best way to explain to you this community that I belong to, is to talk a bit about some of the amazing people that work in the United Nations and who make the United Nations, who make this global community what it is. Here on the left, this young lady named Jennifer Boggs. Jennifer is a good friend of mine, and if you were to look at her profile, you wouldn't think she would ever end up at the UN. She grew up in the US in a red state. She's a NASCAR fan. She went to West Point. After 8 years in the US Army, during those 8 years, she did one stint in Haiti, working on a UN peacekeeping mission. She decided that she wanted to continue to serve not her country but the global community, and join the UN as a logistics officer. That's her in one of the flak jacket. She became the first woman to be the chief logistics officer for the UN peacekeeping base. She served in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jerusalem. She worked on the Ebola response. She's been all over the world. And what she told me, what she found most fascinating is and what keeps her going, is to focus on the things that we all have in common. She said wherever she goes, in every culture, men like to hang around an open fire and grill raw meat. The laughter of children, she says, has no accent. Teenagers the world over, from the Central African Republic to Sudan to the Upper East Side, tend to roll their eyes at their parents. And by focusing on what keeps us together, it keeps motivating her to remain part of this community. Next is Alfred Okello. Alfred has a fascinating story. Alfred was born in the 60s in Uganda. He came from a politically active family. His father was involved in politics. And when he was not even a teenager in the early 70s, there was a violent military coup and a general named Idi Amin came to power, which led to almost a decade-long, very bloody civil war in Uganda. Alfred's father was killed by the new regime, and at age 12, he found himself enrolled by force in a rebel group. At age 12, not even a teenager, he was forced to become a child soldier. And for years, he fought with the rebels against his own will. He was entrapped, he was enslaved as a child soldier, moving around Uganda, finally ending up in southern Sudan, what is now South Sudan. He tried to escape, was put in jail, escaped again, and walked for miles and miles from Sudan into Kenya, through the brush, by himself, at night, hungry. And after these days and days of walking, he found hope in the blue flag of the United Nations. He found a refugee camp, a UN refugee camp, where he was taken in. He was given work. He was able to go back to school. From there, he went to university and went to law school. After law school, he came back to the UN, where he became a prosecutor, a war crimes prosecutor, prosecuting crimes that were committed during the genocide in Rwanda, which I think Jacques talked about. After becoming a prosecutor, he's now in South Sudan, the world's newest country, which for the almost last year has been raped by a horrendous civil war, where he works with military officials and peacekeepers on how to prevent violence against women and how to prevent sexual violence in war against women and girls. And Jacques said to me, you know, he has seen and he has suffered some of the worst atrocities that man could do to man. But through his work at the UN, through his work as a prosecutor, through his work now protecting women's rights, he's also seen the best that people can do, the best that people can contribute to the community. And that's what he loves about his work, and that's what he loves about being part of that community. My other colleague I want to mention to you is a young woman, not much older than you see. She's barely 30. She is a young woman of French and Algerian origin, grew up in the suburbs outside of Paris, managed to get a job in the French diplomatic service, and after a few years had her sights set on the UN. And her first job at the UN was, she was sent to, you know, if there was a place that was in the middle of nowhere, that's where she was sent. It's a town, it's a strip of land called Abyei, which is stuck between South Sudan and Sudan, which is fought over by the two countries. She spent 5 months there as a political advisor to the general who led that mission. She was the only woman in a camp with 4,000 Ethiopian soldiers for almost 5 months, focusing on saving children from rebel groups, ensuring that child soldiers were reunited with their families. And that's what kept her going. She said, seeing the smile of the children, seeing the smile of their families as they were reunited. She's now, from there she went to Mali, and there, that's a picture she took a couple of days ago for me. She's standing with two Moroccan soldiers in the Central African Republic in Bangui, where she works on community rebuilding. Communities that have been torn apart by civil war, and trying to get communities to engage with each other and rebuild their country. And the last person I want to introduce you to is my good friend Chris Mburu. Chris's story, I think, embodies what it means to be part of a community. Chris grew up in a small village in Kenya from a rather poor family. And in Kenya, at the time, primary school was free. But secondary school, you had to take an exam and you had to pay. Chris passed the exam, but his family didn't have the money to pay for school. He was sponsored by a charity that allows people to sponsor a child, and I'm sure all of you have seen those ads on television where you're able to sponsor a child. Well, Chris was one of those children. He went on to secondary school, went on to university in Nairobi, then got a scholarship at Harvard Law, went to Harvard Law, and then came back to Africa and started to work with the United Nations, with the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He's now in Rwanda. I spoke to him a couple of days ago, working on human rights in Rwanda. But what's amazing about Chris is that in 1999, early 2000, he decided to start a foundation to give back to his village, to ensure that children like him would have an opportunity. And he named the foundation the Hilde Foundation, and he named it after Hilde because Hilde was a Swedish woman who had sponsored him. He'd exchanged letters with her when he was a child, but he lost touch with her and had never met her, but he remembered her name, and he named it after her. And after a few years, he decided he wanted to track her down. And he found Hilde through the help of the Swedish Embassy in Nairobi. They found her. She was about 85 at the time. She's 92 now. In a small village in north of Stockholm. Hilde's story wound up being an amazing story in itself. She was born of Jewish parents in Germany before the Second World War. In 1938, she was part of a group of Jewish children who were shipped off to Sweden to safety. She and her brother went. She'd expected her parents to follow suit. Her parents were both killed in Nazi death camps during the war. She grew up an orphan in Sweden. The Swedish government took care of her, trained her as a primary school teacher, and as a teacher, she loved dealing with kids, obviously, but she never had children of her own, never got married, and she wanted to give back to honor those who had helped her. And so she sponsored a child, which wound up being Chris. And Chris finally found her in 2002. And in fact, there's a beautiful movie, if you have a chance to see it, called A Small Act, which is their story. And they've become best friends, and now Hilde is a big part of Chris's foundation. She travels to Kenya once or twice a year to the village, and they work together. And so what I love about this story, you have this arc of community, this arc of giving that literally stretches across 2 centuries, that stretches from Germany to Sweden to Kenya, through different cultures and different peoples, but it's all about being a community. Now, the question that I often ask myself is, what keeps people like Chris, like Zora, like Alfred, and like Jennifer, what keeps them going? What keeps anyone going? Not only people who work at the UN, we don't have a monopoly on giving and caring, being part of a community, but what keeps people going who have those types of jobs? And it's the ability to imagine a different narrative. A narrative where everyone is entitled to a life of dignity and a life of justice. It's not about material things. It's about dignity. It's about being respected and being treated as a human being, no matter where you are. And that's what we try to do with the United Nations. That's what all my colleagues try to do on a daily basis. It's about the ability to always see the human in the other. In face of insurmountable odds, in face of violence and hatred, to ensure that we always see the human in the other. When you start to dehumanize the other, dehumanize even your enemy, whether it's somebody you hate at school, whether it's a whole community based on gender, on sex, on sexual orientation, on anything, it's a pathway to violence and a pathway to darkness. And I think we all have in us that courage to take that first step towards driving change in our communities, whether it's in our neighborhoods, in our countries, or around the world. And I think especially those of you who are young, who are still in school here, you have you have the great ability of not fearing failure. And I think the fear of failure is sometimes what inhibits us. And we see young people having driven change throughout the ages. Recently, you know, in the US in the 60s, in Europe in the late 60s as well, in Southeast Asia in the 70s, in the Arab world just a few years ago. It's young people who have been the driver for change. But when you drive for change, you also have to control it. And you have to ensure that you not only drive for change, but in a sense you're in the driver's seat for change to build the future that you want, which is a future of dignity and justice for all. Thank you very much.